Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about re-rendering inside of components, and we're also going to understand how it extends into this new component structure that we have, because now we have two components. So when we first looked at our component, before this was saying console.log render. I've updated this to say console.log render from card list. And I did this just so that we can be clear that the render log is coming from the card list component. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to comment this out for now. We're going to use this later. But outside of that commented out console log, there's no more console logs. So going back to our application, if we refresh, what we see is that we're calling render from card list twice. Now at this point, I want you to pause and think about why this might be happening. Really think about the flow of all your components. Once you've thought about that, let's explain why this is happening. Render is getting called twice inside of our card list component. Before, when we looked at app.js, when do we see that render gets called? Render gets called when we initialize the application, because constructor gets called first, and then render gets called. And then when we called component did mount and we actually did the fetch, we call a set state. And remember, whenever set state gets called, render gets called again. So we can predict that if I just comment out that and we just look at this render from app.js and I refresh, we saw that we initialize the app, we call render from app.js, and then component did mount happens, and then we do the fetch, we call the set state, again, render from app.js happens. So we know that set state will trigger render from calling. However, components will also re-render when props change. And this is a very important thing because it's just like set state. Whenever props is different, our components will also re-render. So how does the props change inside of card list? Well, let's console.log this.props, and then let's just console log our actual value inside of props so that we see. Let's refresh. When we first render our card list, we are getting passed an empty array. This is the initial state value inside of app.js of our monsters. It's an empty array. That is being passed into card list initially. So card list is getting rendered, and it's getting rendered with an empty array. And then what happens is that we call set state with the full list of users in our component did mount. And here, that's why we see the second time that this array is now a full array. Well, how does React actually know, oh, I've got new values? I need to probably re-render in case the UI is based on our props, which is exactly what's happening. This is why all of these are now updated. Because React is saying, oh, I have new props. Let me re-render the component with the new props. Our props, as we know from our code, directly actually gives us the new monsters. We map over the monsters, which is our props. And that's how we see the UI update with all of these monsters. This is an important thing about components. Components re-render based on two conditions: when set state gets called and when props are updated. This is how primarily React determines that you want to re-render, because only when those things happen does React actually update the DOM and try and see, oh, what are these components and what are the new things that we need to return from them. That's why you see render from card list get called twice. And this goes into a deeper thing when we think about this new component tree. When I say a component tree, what I mean is that you have these parent components and inside there are child components. If we think about it, React always renders from the top down. So what do I mean by top down? If you look at index.js, index.js shows us the very top level component, which is our app component. So what it's going to do is it's going to attempt to render the app component first, meaning it goes to the constructor and then it calls the render call of our app.js. When it's going through render.js, it goes line by line, runs all of our code, and then it goes into this return. And inside here, it now sees card list. Once it sees card list as a component, then it's going to try and run this card list component's different lifecycle methods. So from the card list component, it's going to call the constructor, which even though we haven't written it, it's running it under the hood. And then it's going to run the render and actually render out what's inside. If we had another component here, imagine we have a third component and we call it third component. At this point, after running through the render and the constructor, then it's going to go into another component and it's going to do the same thing. It's going to run this component's constructor, this component's render, and any subsequent children are going to do the same thing. So it's going from top down. And this is the idea of a component tree, where the top of the tree is your parent component, and then each level down is any children that there are, and subsequent children, and et cetera, et cetera. We'll definitely talk about this more, but this is the way that React renders things. So very important thing, remember, React renders on mount, and it re-renders whenever props change and set state gets called. And here we've seen two examples now. We've seen set state where we're calling it, and we saw the render get called. And we're seeing when new props come in, render gets called. So that's a very important thing to think about. When you're looking at your components and thinking about how do I update my components, well, that's how you do it. You either have to make sure that set state is getting called and you're updating the state, or your props are changing. Those are the main ways that you want your components to update. If your component is not updating, then you're probably not either updating props or using set state. So we'll talk about how to leverage this when we want our UI to update, when we make changes and we build complex applications. But this is a very important groundwork to understand about how React determines when it needs to re-render the application and it needs to re-render components. So hopefully now you understand at least the basis of how these components render and re-render. This will get us through the majority of a lot of the rest of building this application and future applications. We just really need to understand this about React and these components rendering and re-rendering. So now that we understand this, let's build out the rest of our application.